Today on Biblical Higher Ed Talk, I sit down with Christen Price, an attorney with the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, to discuss what the center is doing to battle against the pervasive and normalized reality of sexual exploitation. Thank you for tuning in today. I'm your host, Philip Dearborn, president of ABHE, and we truly are honored this week with our guest, Christen Price. I've known Christen now for several years. She is a public member on the board of ABHE, and through that, I've really gotten to know her. She's an attorney with the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, and I've invited her in to talk about what really is a difficult subject, a lot of hard stories that I've actually heard from Christen that we won't be sharing in this podcast, but certainly some tough issues. So I just want to kind of give that as a disclaimer ahead of this show that we're going to be delving deep into sexual exploitation and the ugliness of it, the sin of it, but also hearing the positive of what Christen and the folks there at the center are doing. So Christen, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So we're going to get into some of these questions that you and I have kind of talked through beforehand. But before we do that, just so our audience can get to know you a little bit, talk to us about a defining moment in your life that has kind of led you to where you are today in the work that you're doing.
Yes. So one really defining moment for me came when I was still a student at Cedarville University in undergrad. And I was procrastinating in the library one night.
I can't imagine that.
Which still felt studious because I was in the library looking at books and things. And I was looking at some of the magazines, and I can't remember the name of the paper now, but I happened across an article that was talking about the work of International Justice Mission. And I already knew I wanted to be an attorney, but I had never seen anything like this. And for those who aren't familiar, International Justice Mission is a global Christian organization that addresses human rights abuses around the world, especially by focusing on the functionality of legal systems and addressing violent crimes within them. And so I just didn't know, one, that crimes like slavery, like sex trafficking, other forms of trafficking in persons were even still occurring, let alone that there was something specific that lawyers could be doing about it. And so it was extremely inspiring in terms of just realizing what was happening and what was possible to be done about it. But then the other thing that I think was really profound in shaping me was that it was the first time I had really encountered anything that challenged me to think about injustice as a Christian. It was really my first time to be faced with justice as a theological category and as an ethical imperative. And so that was quite a defining moment that really set me on the path to the kind of work that I'm involved in today.
So you attended their undergrad. Where did you go on for grad school and getting your law degree?
I moved to Washington, D.C. after graduation to pursue a law degree at Georgetown and fell in love with the city and have been here ever since.
Beautiful city. I often say Washington, D.C. has its own culture, doesn't it? A lot of activity depending on what's happening politically, but there's definitely a kind of a neat culture all to itself. You launched your career, you did your education, you did those things. What drew you specifically to now working at the National Center on Sexual Exploitation? Why that?
Honestly, in many ways, it was my love for D.C. that kind of put me on the path to Nicosi specifically. When I reached out to them, I had no idea that they even had a legal team. I was looking to have a conversation and just kind of find out what was generally going on in the anti-trafficking field. But I also was really concerned as a resident of DC. I had learned and was just really horrified to find that a member of the city council at that time was doing his best to make prostitution fully legal within the district. And just to be clear, I'm not talking about protecting prostituted people from being arrested or prosecuted, which I think is actually really important to do. I mean, his proposal would have decriminalized pimping, brothel keeping, sex buying. And for those who don't know, DC is already an extremely divided city when it comes to money, power, education, so on. And even people who don't necessarily have a lot of material wealth can be quite privileged in terms of their access to power and their credentials. And so there's that category of person in the city. And then there are people who live in a really different reality in our nation's capital. And that's who would be really especially vulnerable to being bought, sold, rented. And sex buyers tend to be fairly educated. They tend to have six-figure incomes. They usually are actually in a stable marriage or other partnership. Most of them are white. Almost all of them are male. And so this is the kind of situation we would have had very, very starkly in the city if that had succeeded. So I wrote to the National Center and asked them, I'm a resident. Is there anything I can do? Not really much of a protester or rally type, but I figured I could write a letter. And I really was willing to at least show up and hold a sign. And their response was, would you like to testify at City Hall? And my response was, no, I would not like that. But they persuaded me against my better judgment. And it turned out they were also building out a legal team and needed to hire a lawyer. So it was a really just, I think, providential intersection that led me here.
Yeah.
And happily, the bill failed at the last minute due to this really powerful opposition involving a lot of survivor leaders opposing it. So it failed.
I love that story because we often talk about this on the show about the sovereignty of God, how he leads a lot of our guests. It's not like you were checking the classifieds and, hey, what legal job can I get? It truly was out of a reaction to your surroundings. Here, God is in the background working all of these elements together. And you had worked with the Alliance Defending Freedom before and had a great career there. And now this opportunity to use your skills. And even going back to when you were studying in your undergrad and in that library, just that common theme and that thread about how God has kind of used all of those pieces. And what's exciting for me, Christen, is you've got many years ahead. And there are so many opportunities for you to continue to make a difference in the work that you do.
Thank you for saying that. I truly hope so.
Absolutely. Again, you and I have had some conversations and specific stories, and because of the nature of your kind of work, we're not going to go that direction in this particular podcast. But know that there are some stories, and we'll kind of ask about how you process through that based off of the things that you see. So, Christen, talk to us about sexual exploitation. That is a very broad term. Help us understand what it is that we're talking about.
Well, at a really basic level, sexual exploitation is a failure to recognize the dignity of another person who is made in the image of God, and it's seeing a fellow human being with all of that dignity and all of that worth and all of that freedom, designed for freedom, as just a means to my ends. We know that sex was created by God for connection within a mutual, consensual, exclusive marriage. And sexual exploitation completely perverts that and turns it instead into use. So treating other human beings as objects to be used. And it includes, obviously, rape, sex trafficking, sex buying, non-consensually shared pornography, sextortion, spy cam recordings, and other forms of sexual abuse. And it can be committed by anyone: bosses, teachers, coaches, pastors, husbands. If I could define sex trafficking a little bit as well, because that's a big focus of the center's work, it occurs when a person is engaging in any kind of commercial sex act, whether that's in pornography, in prostitution, strip clubs, and then they're either under the age of 18, so they're a child, then it's always sex trafficking, or they're an adult, but they've been induced through force, fraud, or coercion. But it's important to note that force isn't necessary, or like movement across the border. It doesn't have to be that. It's actually often perpetrated by people familiar to the victim, including their own biological families. And it can include webcam platforms like OnlyFans. It can include something called sugar dating, which is, you might guess, involves like older, wealthier partners seeking out younger people. So that's kind of a broad look at some of the things, especially in the context of sex trafficking or crimes. But it is broader than crimes. It includes consuming pornography, hookup culture, and I would argue any kind of normalizing of violence, even in, supposedly consensual sexual relationships, as well as in child marriage is another way that this happens.
Yeah, one of the things, and you mentioned it kind of at the beginning there, of what kind of a broad definition of here's something that God created, something very beautiful, imperfection, sexuality. And sin has just kind of just like sin takes everything that God created in perfection and perverts it. Second thing that I want to say is that when you and I first talked about doing this podcast, didn't realize how much sexual exploitation happens within the family context. Like it's known from generation to generation to generation. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's a very disturbing reality that a significant percentage of sex trafficking occurs with the biological family member being the one to traffic, especially a child. One very common scenario is a biological mother trafficking a child for drugs. This is usually a mom who's addicted, struggling with substance abuse. When it's a more clearly for-profit situation where they're just trying to make money, usually a biological father or stepfather is involved. But it shows how sexual exploitation can be something that is part of a person's story from the very beginning and even shapes what they see as normal or possible.
So you've defined it for us. You've given us kind of illustrations of the breadth of what we're talking about with this. So then what do you do? So you're an attorney. What does the center do? Like, how are you addressing what you see out there as far as the sexual exploitation?
So the National Center, we're a nonprofit and we're dedicated to eradicating all forms of sexual abuse and exploitation, especially by exposing the links between them. And our approach is to do this in a multidisciplinary way that involves research and corporate advocacy, corporate social responsibility, legislation, and the law. Within the Law Center, our strategy, our philosophy of change is just basically connected to the fact that crimes have perpetrators, but systemic crimes, including sex trafficking, have perpetrators and enablers. And under federal law, the crime of sex trafficking explicitly includes people who enable and profit from it. So there may be a little bit on the sidelines, but not fully. They're kind of facilitators. So we represent sex trafficking survivors in civil lawsuits against both the perpetrators and the enablers, especially those that are mainstream, corporate, institutional, so big businesses, government entities. In the status quo, it's profitable for them to look the other way or to enable these crimes in some way. Our goal is to make it costly for them instead so that they stop.
Yeah, which I don't think people realize that the laws are written that way. So it's not just the actual act. It's those who in some way, like you said, either look the other way or just kind of permit it to happen or make money off of it. So your job is to go after those individuals.
Yes, exactly. And so we've got cases against Pornhub, Twitter, OnlyFans, some strip clubs, brothels, government entities in Nevada. But the idea is really to get at these websites and other mainstream profiteers.
Yeah. Is Nevada the only place in the United States where these kinds of things are legalized?
Nevada is the only place in the U.S. where prostitution is legal, and it's only legal ostensibly in the rural areas. So they have legal brothels out there, but it is prevalent throughout the state, especially in Vegas, as you can imagine, where it shows up in escorting and strip clubs, especially.
So for you as an attorney, where are you putting your efforts? Like, are you in court? Are you writing briefs? Are you like, what's your everyday kind of look like?
Lots of brief writing for sure. In civil litigation, you don't always spend as much time in court itself. So a lot of the arguing and a lot of the fighting about the facts happens outside of the courtroom itself. So in our Pornhub case, which is the furthest along, we may very well be looking at a trial at some point this year because we've gone through the whole fact-finding process, we've argued the briefs, and so on.
Wow. And maybe a little side note, we have a lot of students on our campuses, and there are probably younger versions of you who are studying in the library who maybe feel God's call to step into this space. Does the center have internship opportunities or ways that students who perhaps our listeners can identify as, hey, this is an area of interest? What advice would you give to them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, please look us up and apply. We love interns. We could not do what we do without them. Mm-hmm. And in the Law Center, the chief requirement is just that you be a law student, but we have other kinds of internships for undergrad and graduate students as well.
Good. So you have some stats, or I should say the center has some stats that paint a picture of how broadly sexual exploitation is part of our everyday life. Kind of walk us through some of that.
Yes. So I think I would like to walk us through a couple of different areas to just give something of a picture of some of the things that we're up against. And I want to focus on pornography use, violence and pornography, and then racism. So for pornography use, there's a lot of survey data collected over the last 50 years that just shows this slight progression and then a massive jump. So in the 70s, usage among US men was around 26%, about 30% in the 80s, 32% in the 90s, to only really 34% in the 2000s, just about 20 years ago. But studies of pornography use in the US, Korea, and Australia over the last decade, two of those countries, by the way, have really significant Christian populations, by contrast, place regular male use between 84% and 94%.
Wow. So that goes from, what was your early 2000s statistic?
34%.
So 34 to 80 something in a matter of 20 years. Wow.
Yes. So, I mean, obviously you see with the internet, and it's much easier to be anonymous and so on. And this kind of pervasiveness, mainstreaming applies not only to patterns of use, but also to creation, where people are able to use AI and technology to create deepfake pornography so that it looks like someone, maybe they know that never had anything to do with pornography, but they create this thing. And there was a study that found that over a 2-year period, the total number of deepfakes doubled every 6 months. And malicious and pornography deepfakes made up 93% of those. 90% of those targeted women. And they can be found on Pornhub, on other mainstream pornography sites.
Wow. What else?
Violence and pornography. The feminist legal theorist Catherine McKinnon once famously said that pornography has to be done to women in order to be made. And a 2010 analysis, so 15 years old, it's gotten much worse now, found that in the top pornography videos, there's physical violence in 88% of them. And this is just incredibly disturbing when you think about how things have continued to escalate. And there have been videos on Pornhub and on these other mainstream sites that clearly show someone who's incapacitated, like incapable of consent, whether it's because of drugs or they're unconscious. And I think it's important to note that there's definitely been increased female use of pornography, especially with women and girls under 25. But what's consumed is still largely the same. It's men subjecting women to sexual violence and humiliation. And it's providing scripts for sexual activity where emotional intimacy and affection are not there, but aggression and physically risky practices are very prevalent. So it ends up providing a kind of propaganda for sexual assault. There was a BBC study that surveyed over 2,000 men in the UK who were between the ages of 18 and 39. 71% of them admitted to using some form of violence against a partner, including slapping and choking, much of it by their admission, pornography inspired. And 33% of them said they didn't even try to get consent first.
So that kind of defeats the argument of, well, it's harmless. Watching porn is a harmless act. There's actually statistics that show that it actually does impact behavior.
Yes, that it's extremely harmful, first of all, to the person who's depicted in it. But then additionally, it doesn't remain there. It also extends to, other relationships. And then a 2023 study of 5,000 college women at one university found that nearly 2/3 of them, and again, this ties back to what pornography is normalizing, nearly 2/3 of them had been choked during sex. 1/3 said that a partner had done this to them in their most recent sexual encounter, and roughly 25% of those women were between the ages of 12 and 17 the first time it happened. Just horrifying on so many levels.
It is. I can see why you've been drawn to do something about this, right?
Yes. And in terms of my last category, just for statistics and kind of painting a picture, is just the reality of racism in the sex trade and who's disproportionately affected, with women and girls of color being disproportionately victims of sex trafficking. And this has been a really disturbing reality in this country since the days of chattel slavery. In the 1830s and 40s, one of the biggest slave trading firms just outside DC in Alexandria, it was basically two pimps. They were sex traffickers in the New Orleans market, and that was what they did, and it was totally normalized. According to the group Rights for Girls, 52% of children trafficked for sex in King County, Washington, so the Seattle area, are Black, and 84% are girls, even though Black girls only comprise 1.1% of that population. And then similar phenomenon in South Dakota, where Native people are 8% of the population, but 40% of the sex trafficking victims are Native women.
Yeah, we have a couple schools that are members of ABHE that work among Native populations. I've had the opportunity to visit and actually speak with a number of those students, and have always walked away discouraged and encouraged at the same time. Discouraged to hear their stories that just will break your heart in reservation type situations, but then also the incredible hope that comes based off of the work that some of our institutions are doing to just address this head on and say, this is not right, and to work those students through, and to hear stories of even their graduates going back and ministering back into those contexts, trying to break the chain of that violence. Curious if, do you see, like these are the statistics that you've provided in those three categories, those are in the United States. Is it okay to assume that that's the reality, if not worse, around the world?
I think it's a little bit hard to say when it comes to pornography, because I think that US use might be a little bit disproportionate. I'm not 100% sure on that, but we definitely have a big share of the market here. But the statistics regarding the kind of 84% to 94%, that was actually from the US, Korea, and Australia.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's definitely a global problem.
For you personally, and I want to kind of get this to you, because I know this because, and again, we won't share the stories, but there's some just pretty difficult things that you have to actually see and work through. So for you personally, when you see stuff, when you hear these stories, again, we can't imagine them. How do you personally navigate through that depravity without it impacting you negatively?
I think it was Nietzsche in Beyond Good and Evil who said something to the effect, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, that when you look into the abyss, it looks back at you. And I definitely think there's some truth to that. I don't think it's passable. And I think that's just kind of the cost of encountering things that are truly evil. I don't think it's possible for it to not affect you negatively, but I don't think that has to be the end of the story. And I find myself personally returning to two theological truths in particular in response to what we encounter in this work and just the stories that you hear. And the first is Christ on the cross. Like, there's no element of the abyss that he hasn't entered. He's with us in every imaginable suffering. There's no form of evil that has escaped his notice or his presence. He quite literally knows where all the bodies are buried, and he's still able to look at the world with love. And so I find that this is a profound counter to any temptation toward cynicism. And then the other theological piece is Christ victorious. There's no element of the darkness that he hasn't triumphed over. So he rose from the dead. He's making everything new. He's going to put it right. And so whatever piece of that any one of us is called to faithfully join him in, we're joining him. It's his work. It's not all on us. We don't have to carry it. And I find it like especially remarkable and just comforting to reflect on Isaiah 58, which is a really profound, powerful call to the people of God to pursue justice, and makes it very clear this is a moral imperative. There's spiritual implications. God will not hear your prayers if you don't do this. But at the end of the chapter, there's this whole directive about practicing the Sabbath, about resting. And one of the implications of believing that God holds up and is taking care of the universe is that you can rest, and you can rest in hope, because you know that evil is not going to have the final word. When there are times it's easier than at other times, but it's just an act of faith that you take a step back and really believe he'll be as good as his word.
Yeah. This has been a phenomenal conversation, and I appreciate you sharing and kind of walking through some difficult content. And we're kind of coming close to the end here, but we got a couple minutes. So if the listeners are anything like me, it's like, okay, so what can we do about it? We're thrilled that Christen Price is in Washington, D.C., working with the Center on Sexual Exploitation. Happy that organization exists. but kind of bring the message down to us as leaders within biblical and Christian higher education. What's one thing that you want them to take away from this conversation that they can just turn around and be challenged with and perhaps even apply within their contexts?
My one thing is pretty direct, which is that men can stop this. What they do really matters here. I find it wonderful and encouraging that so many people, especially many young people, are just very compassionate and really want to fight trafficking in persons. And in this fight, I think there can be this tendency to focus on vulnerabilities, which is important. I mean, when it comes to sex trafficking, the risk factors include poverty, homelessness, child sexual abuse, incest, being in foster care, and being a woman or a girl. Psychological manipulation is also part of this. But I think it's important to recognize that a risk factor is not the same thing as a cause. None of these vulnerabilities cause sex trafficking. One thing causes sex trafficking, and that is male demand for prostitution and pornography. Sex buyers are almost exclusively male, including when the victim is male, and pornography is also just really driven and shaped by male demand. So men have the power to end this by refusing to participate and also by refusing to be complicit. And I think there's absolutely a very key, a powerful role biblical higher education leaders and institutions can play in just the spiritual and the moral formation that's really necessary here.
Yeah. And sometimes it's such an uncomfortable conversation that the thing I appreciate about the nature of this episode is that we're just talking about it, right? Let's quit hiding. And I would imagine that there are much more comfortable sins for us to talk about and address on our campuses. Are there resources that the center provides for college presidents or directors or deans, or are there resources available for them to go to kind of help address this issue on their campuses?
Yes, absolutely. We have a resources page, and some of the content may be like a little bit more aimed at individuals or aimed at parents, but a lot of it, I think, carries over because you're absolutely right. It's a conversation that has to be had, and it can be difficult, and it can be easy to, even in having it, I think, shy away from talking about the worst parts of it because there are different components. There are reasons people become drawn to pornography, some of which are out of their control. There are addictive components to it, but there's also a very clear, very profound moral component, a moral imperative. And so I think kind of starting from a place of truth and honesty, even though it's really difficult, but that takes all of that into account, is very necessary for restoration and for reform.
Yeah. Yeah, good. Well, we've come to the end of the show, Christen. I just want to say on behalf of all of us in biblical higher education, thank you for the work that you do. And you are addressing it literally on a daily basis. And our prayers and thoughts are with you as you kind of navigate through all of these difficulties. And if you're listening to this and you've been challenged or convicted, I encourage you to go to our show description. And in that description will be a link to the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. And you can kind of see the work that Christen does as well as the rest of the organization. And then I definitely want to point you towards that resource page if you want to take action for you personally or for your campus. So until next time, stay kingdom focused.